Hi everyone, I'm sitting here with cannabis activist and historian Chris Bennett and attorney Kirk Tousaw, and we're talking today about cannabis, religion, and spirituality, and a court case that's currently moving its way through our courts about Mr. Chris Bennett. Chris, actually, why don't you fill us in on exactly what your court case is, a little bit of the history about where we are here now.
Well, I've been a religious user, a spiritual user of cannabis for over 20 years, as I can document, and I've been a Church of the Universe reverend for about that long as well. And I've written a number of books on this, Green Gold, The Tree of Life, Marijuana, Magic and Religion, Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible, and most recently Cannabis and the Soma Solution, as well as articles for High Times, Cannabis Culture, and other magazines, so some people may be familiar with my work. And about 2 years ago now, Kirk Tousaw and I, sitting beside me here, wrote Health Canada and requested an Exemption 56, which is a type of an exemption that Health Canada can grant for spiritual, religious, scientific, or medical purposes. And we asked for an Exemption 56 from the marijuana laws so I could partake of my cannabis sacrament legally. This request was summarily rejected, and then this led to a review process in federal court of Health Canada's decision on the rejection. And Kirk and I have been going through the laborious court system over the last couple of years, and we've done depositions and given affidavits from professors and cross-examined Health Canada, and now we're just heading in for final arguments next week on Tuesday and Wednesday, November 8th and 9th.
Excellent. So now maybe go into a little bit of the history of what it is you're asking the court for, why you want to do this, and why you believe what you believe.
Well, this is the first federal court case for this, but there have been provincial court cases. I was involved in another case in the 1990s, around 95. Late Reverend Ian Hunter used to be around here in the cannabis scene, passed away a few years ago in a boating accident. And in that case, Judge Montague Drake, who was 75 years old, second generation Canadian judge, last case, after a week of testimony, he concluded that Ian Hunter was in fact sincere about his belief that cannabis was the tree of life, that cannabis had in fact been used historically as a religious sacrament, but he couldn't allow that case to proceed further in the courts because then he would have to allow thugis who ritually murder people or cannibals who ritually eat people to practice their faith by that same sort of legal status.
That's what the judge said.
That's what the judge kind of said in his decision, which is kind of a moot point because those require victims and the violations of somebody else's charter rights, whereas cannabis use is a victimless crime. Ian, who was charged with growing cannabis in his front window of his store, the Sacred Herb in Victoria, and selling cannabis seeds, decided not to appeal the case because he just got a small fine of a few $100s. And that case kind of led to, in many ways, led to the modern, Canadian cannabis seed sales industry because people saw this low precedent case and decided to open shop doors. And there's many seed sales still open in Canada, despite Mark Emery's situation with the U.S. and seed sales. So this case, and then there was recently the G13 case in Ontario, where the G13, a Church of the Universe mission, had been supplying sacrament to members who signed a statement saying that they believed that cannabis was the tree of life and it was their religious sacrament. Some undercover officers went in and lied to the members of the G13 and procured sacrament, and this led to an arrest and a raid of the G13 and a trial. In that trial, the judge ruled that they were, in fact, religious users of cannabis, but they couldn't allow for the distribution of cannabis. And so our case is different in the sense that what we've requested is just a personal exemption from the cannabis laws. I've asked that I be allowed to possess about 7 grams a day for my daily consumption and allowed to grow enough plants to supply those needs. And so we haven't requested any sort of mass distribution situation for the sacrament, but just the personal use. And also we provided affidavits from professors, 3 professors who read my books, 2 of those affidavits handed in. And I also helped the G13 case with getting Professor Carl Ruck as an expert witness in their case in regards to the historical role of cannabis in religion. We also provided a government document, the historical and cultural uses of cannabis, prepared by the Canadian Justice Department, that reviews a lot of my own research and verifies the sources and suggests that we need to have a more open approach, considering the cultural milieu which we now live in and the fantastic history of cannabis, which has played a role, I would say, in all the world's major religions. A role in their inception and amongst the mystics of those faiths.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to get into the court stuff in just a second, but quickly, for those who aren't familiar with your work, maybe just go into that a little bit. Why do you believe that cannabis is the tree of life?
Well, I had a religious experience about 21 years ago that led to this belief. Reading the Book of Revelation, smoking cannabis. There were a number of events that led to that. One of these things was, what first got me reading the Bible was the whole Mount Cashel orphanage controversy. And this is where Catholic priests were first getting exposed en masse for molesting children. And I was trying to understand. I wasn't really brought up with religion, so I started kind of reading the Bible. Coinciding with that, the Clayoquot Sound controversy. I lived out in Euclid at that time. My brother was a camp chairman for the International Woodworkers Association. He was a logger and union guy, and grew up logging, fishing, that type of stuff. So that was a really big change out there in that world. And around that same time, I found out about the industrial uses of hemp. At that time, people had completely forgotten what hemp was. People knew what marijuana was, but that hemp could make paper and fuel, fiber, and even the word hemp itself had kind of gone on the back burner, and people didn't even know what it was anymore. And when I found out, about hemp for paper, when 1 acre of hemp produces as much paper as 4 acres of trees over the same 20 years period, when 50% of the trees getting cut in Canada were going to paper, I became a hemp activist. And then also following along was the Gulf War in Iraq, the initial phase, where Saddam had fired a Scud missile into Israel. And because Babylon sits in ancient Iraq and Saddam was attacking Israel, they were comparing him to Nebuchadnezzar, the last king of Babylon. And I was reading some news story about this, and I thought, well, I'm going to read the Book of Revelation. That was tying it in with the Book of Revelations, Revelations 14. I thought, I'm going to read the Book of Revelation right now. And smoking a joint about 3 in the morning at this fish plant I was a night watchman at, and I was reading it, and I saw that John, he took a scroll and he put it in his mouth, and it tasted as sweet as honey, and then he swallowed it, and it turned bitter in his stomach, and he began to prophesy. And I was like, sounds like this guy's eating something, Okay. And then there was all these references to billowing clouds of smoke that came with the prayers of the saints and sackcloth, and I was like, sounds really kind of druggy, kind of oriented. And then I got to the last paragraph of the Bible, Revelations 22, where it says, the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And when I read that, I had this powerful experience where I felt like light just started pouring into my body, and that was a reference to cannabis and all the uses of the hemp plant and marijuana medicine. And, I thought about how hemp fuel could end these Gulf War fights we were having for access to Mideast oil, and how we could get rid of soil-depleting cotton, and how we could make the most nutritious food out of this wonderful plant, and what a great medicine it was. And I'd have to say, in the intervening 21 years, it has proved itself to me that it is capable of all that. And, anybody that knows about cannabis knows what a miracle it is. And so, I called my wife up at the time. She thought I was having some sort of breakdown the next day. I couldn't tell. Was I just kind of going crazy, or was there something to it? And so I decided to, if there was anything to it, then somebody somewhere will have written about it. And I started collecting data on the role of cannabis in religion. And that led to the writing of my books. And, I didn't know at the time, but scholars decades before I was born were talking about biblical references to cannabis under the name cannabosum, and it played a role in the holy anointing oil and incense of both Judaism and Christianity. And not just that, around the world, in India, Shiva, the world's oldest god, continually worship God, is the Lord of cannabis. Buddha is said to have subsisted on 1 cannabis seed a day during the periods he sat under the Bodhi tree before his own revelation. Sikhism, the Nihang Sikhs, that's their main sacrament, and they're the guardians of the Sikh tradition. Taoism goes right back to the very beginnings of Taoism in China, and this is like plant here is now just kind of re-emerging, and all this information is coming up and welling up in the same way that when Jack Herer wrote his book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes, it opened the floodgates of hemp history. Once you put in that hemp key in the door, the same way when we take that key of cannabis as a religious sacrament and put it in that door, all that information was just waiting there to be discovered again and put out there. And that's what's happening. And in this case, whether we win or lose, is kind of a part of that mission of making way for the tree of life, which is kind of the mandate of the Church of the Universe.
Cool. So let's get into the case then. Maybe a little bit about where we are now, and just how the process started, where you guys are at this moment, and what's happening in the future coming up here.
Sure. So what we did is, on Chris's behalf, we put together a statutory declaration. It's a written declaration under oath that you swear under penalty of perjury. And Chris outlined his religious beliefs and his religious epiphany and the history that he's just given you in some lesser detail. And then, because the government has an exemption scheme for marijuana currently existing for those that consume it for medical purposes, we look to that scheme for guidance in what the Minister of Health, who administers that scheme and who's also responsible for giving Section 56 exemptions for the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the person we were going to request an exemption from, we looked at what that minister needs from people before giving them a license to possess and produce marijuana. Of course, we left the medical piece out because it's not a medical request, but we talked about security measures that he would take to preserve the production site, how much he consumed, what the government's formula reveals that to yield in a certain number of plants, and we gave them, the declarations about safety that they require. Not that those things are necessarily true, that we believe in them, but we thought, if this is what's required to issue an exemption from the marijuana laws, we want to give as much of that information to the minister as possible. And we did that. The minister took a while and rejected the request, said it wasn't in the public interest, didn't follow up with Mr. Bennett to ask any questions or anything like that, but just said, look, issuing you this exemption is not in the public interest. Right. And so we took a judicial review of that decision in federal court, in the Federal Court Trial Division here in Vancouver. We also argued that either the prohibition on Sections 4, Section 7 of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the prohibition on possession or production for personal use, violate the charter in the absence of this exemption process. And we said it violates the charter really in three ways. First, that Section 2 of the charter is violated. Section 2 of the charter is the religious freedom guarantees. Right. And we said, look, this is a man with a very sincere belief that cannabis is a sacrament, that cannabis provides him with a connection to the divine and to his spiritual purpose and life. And he's being absolutely prohibited from practicing that religion as a result of either the prohibition or the minister's decision. And that's a violation, we say, of Section 2. We said also that it's a violation of Section 7 of the Charter. Now, Section 7 of the Charter protects your life, your liberty, and your security of the person from infringement except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. And what we said is, look, in terms of the liberty interest, obviously that's engaged because Mr. Bennett could go to jail. He could be arrested and go to jail for practicing his religion. It's also engaged, and here we relied on the Parker medical marijuana decision out of the Court of Appeal of Ontario. It's also engaged because he's forced to choose between his liberty, his freedom from incarceration or arrest, and his religious practice, and that choice itself is an infringement of his liberty interest. Not just the prospect of going to jail, but being forced to make that choice. And that's because liberty encompasses making decisions of fundamental personal importance. And we say choice of religion, religious practice is that. And I think it's clear from what Chris has said, he's a guy that believes that to be the case for him and for his own spirituality.
That's right.
And we said security of the person's infringed because the state cannot, with a criminal prohibition, impose criminal sanction on people and interfere with choices that go to their core psychological and physical integrity, choices about their own body. And we say there's a security of the person infringement because they're forcing him actually to suffer psychologically and physically as a result of the prohibition on cannabis. So that's the liberty and security of the person interest. That's Section 7. And what we relied upon is that the law is arbitrary and it causes grossly disproportionate effects. It's arbitrary, in short, because it does not actually further the objectives of the prohibition. The prohibition is supposed to be there to promote health and protect public safety. That's from the Melvin Levine case. We learned that's